brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue. I am a real American, fight for the rights of every man. American woman, mama, let me be. Born in the USA.
Mr. Roosevelt, he asked, when are you going to get beyond the boyishness of killing things? Are you not getting far enough along to leave that off? Oh, hi class. How you guys doing? I'm just tucking somebody in, she loves a good book at bedtime. Speaking of books, have I ever told you about how important books are in American history? Well, I'll tell you what. Let's go back in time. Doc. Oh. Hi. You're back. Books. Yeah, books. Okay. So anyway, on the subject of books, have you ever wondered how important books are in American history? And I don't just mean books, I mean magazines, newspaper articles, anything that we read. How important they've been throughout history in terms of agents of change. Let's think about Thomas Paine when he wrote Common Sense and how that helped spawn the American Revolution. Harriet Beecher Stowe when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Every Tom Clancy... No, wait, that's just me. Never mind. Okay, so anyway, books. It's time. I need you to know this word tattooed on your forehead. Name your third-born child after it from now for the rest of your life. Anytime Mr. Eschbacher says to you, muckrakers, you're going to say digging up the dirt. Let's practice. Muckrakers. Muckrakers. Good, you got that. Okay, so what is a muckraker? A muckraker is what we would today call an investigative reporter. They're a journalist who literally digs up corruption, exposes the dirt, shows America what's going on, holds it up and says, hey, do something about it. Muckrakers have exposed all kinds of problems, from crooked oil companies to an octopus, well, figuratively, symbolically, not literally, to what's in your food, even to cocaine and soda. But that's a story for another day. So if I say muckrakers, you say digging up the dirt. The term muckraker actually comes from, well, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. By the way, this moment in hero worship brought to you by Douglas Brinkley's book, Wilderness Warrior. If you want a good read about Teddy and his environmental policy, there you go. But Teddy once compared the muckrakers to a character in an old children's story called Pilgrim's Progress. This character spends his entire life trying to dig the muck and the slime and the mud out of the bottom of this pond, and never once in his life looks up to realize he lives in the middle of this beautiful forest. Teddy thought that the muckrakers dwelled too much on negatives, but that doesn't mean he doesn't listen to them. Oh boy, did he listen to them. In fact, the muckrakers are going to provide Teddy with, should we say, an excuse to become a major instrument of change. We'll also talk about muckraking and how it applies in more modern times. We'll go all the way into the 1960s and even into the 21st century. So, if we're going to talk about muckrakers, the first thing we have to do is we have to talk about magazines. And I'm sure my crack cameraman, director, and special effects guy, John, will put a magazine image right up here. And if you ever think about magazines, they're very popular. Magazines allow you to get all kinds of stuff in circulation. You can read about anything you want, hunting, fishing, mountains in some faraway continent, the Bengals winning a playoff game against the Chiefs, you name it, magazines let you read it. We love magazines because they've got pictures. The stories are short, and magazines really first become popular right about the time of the muckrakers. So the muckrakers could write their stories and they could sell them to magazines who had nationwide distribution. It wasn't just the Syracuse Post-Standard. It was a magazine like Harper's, McClure's. They were popular magazines that did muckraking, and they had a nationwide circulation. And very often what they would do is they would buy the muckraker story, chop it up into its parts, And then that way, you'd be on the hook. Hey, I've got to buy the next installment in this magazine. So if we're going to talk about muckrakers tonight, we've got to talk about the Mac Daddy of muckrakers, Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was a socialist. Now, understand, when we talk about the Progressive Party, the socialists, this is really like their high water mark in American society. They are really pushing hard. They want to change. They want to end capitalism. And in many cases, the Progressive Era itself was like a way to say, hey, let's save capitalism from the socialists. Sinclair wrote what is now maybe the most famous piece of muckraking literature ever, The Jungle.
Welcome to the jungle.
No, John, not that jungle. Okay, good, thank you. So he wrote this book in 1906, and it's a novel. It is fiction, okay? But it was based upon research that he did about the Chicago stockyards. You know Chicago and what they're the home of, right?
The Bears.
So he writes this novel about the struggles of the meatpacking plant workers, most of whom were immigrants, new immigrants from places in Eastern Europe like Lithuania. But he also writes about, the wounds they have. He talks about meeting workers missing fingers, and the cuts on their hands that paralyze them, and the chill, the cold in the chilling rooms that causes rheumatism, and the chemicals they're exposed to. Sinclair writes about what was called embalmed beef, how during the 1898 Spanish-American War, in an effort to fulfill their contracts with the U.S. military, these meatpacking companies were shoveling moldy stuff off the ground, grinding it up into hoppers, and then to remove the smell of this nasty rotted meat, just filling it full of chemicals, embalming it like you do with a dead body. Fun fact, during the Spanish-American War, about 5,000 American soldiers died. Only about 500 from combat fatalities. The rest from diseases caused by mosquitoes or food poisoning. Now, the meat packers love to brag. We use everything but the squeal. And in his fictionalized account, Sinclair, again, draws on research to do this, but writes about meeting a meat inspector and how this guy goes on and on, telling you all about how dangerous it was if you didn't properly inspect the meat, how tubercular cows would have these big pussy sores under the skin, and when the meat packers would slice and rip into the cattle, they would just get covered in blood, but they'd get covered in all this pus. And you ever pop a zit? Now imagine a zit the size of a softball. Sinclair talks about the chemicals that go into these meats. Borax, which you would commonly, guys, find in your kitchen. It's a household cleaner. Coal tar dye. It's the stuff that makes cigarettes give you cancer. Glycerin, ladies, for your fingernails. And basically they could make anything look like, smell like, I guess kind of taste like, whatever you wanted. And they sold a wide variety of canned meat products. Now remember, this is a time when Americans, most of us didn't have refrigerators. So unless you were living in the country on the farm and you could go out and, slaughter your own animal, you were eating canned meat. And these meatpacking companies would sell potted grouse, potted game hen, potted chicken. Problem is, Sinclair points out, you see cows going in these factories. You see pigs going in these factories. You don't see chickens. Ain't no chicken in potted chicken. Again, the meat packers used everything but the squeal. Pick your most disgusting body part. It got grinded up to make sausage. He would write about rats running across piles of moldy meat, and the rats would bite the workers, so the workers would put poison loaves of bread out. And then the moldy meat, the poison bread, and the rats would all go get ground up to make sausage. Now, Sinclair's goal was to make a case for socialism, to point out these terrible working conditions. Well, if you want to really look at the impact of his book, use his quote. Sinclair famously said, "I aimed for their hearts, but instead I hit their stomachs." because people weren't too worried about unsafe working conditions when they said, "I'm eating what?" Now, the story is that Teddy Roosevelt was given an advance copy of The Jungle. He was reading it at the breakfast table and was so disgusted by it, he acted. He prompted Congress to pass two pieces of legislation in 1906, the same year The Jungle was published. The Pure Food and Drug Act, which now requires companies to do things like list ingredients, not just for foods, but also for medications, to crack down on, wonder tonics. How people called snake oil salesmen or con artists would sell products claiming they could cure everything under the sun, all in the same little potion. In fact, Coca-Cola was originally created by a pharmacist in Atlanta as a tonic to try to make you feel better. And yes, you felt better because it was made from cocaine. But when they were mixing it together, instead of mixing it with water, the guy at the pharmacy accidentally mixed it with soda water, and thus a multi-billion-dollar corporation was formed. No cocaine in Coca-Cola today. The other big piece of legislation that we get passed by Sinclair is the Meat Inspection Act. And this is near and dear to my heart. If you think about it, Sinclair puts up a big fight over food. Yeah, a food fight. And without Upton Sinclair's efforts, you wouldn't have safe meat to eat. Prior to The Jungle, if meat was inspected, it was done, on the honor system by the meatpacking companies or by city inspectors. This now required the federal government to get involved to make sure that whatever you're eating, whatever you're barbecuing, that you're eating good.
We're eating good tonight, Martha.
All right, so moving along, our next muckraker is Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell wrote History of Standard Oil. She was writing about whose company? That's right, The Rock.
It's about drive.
No, John, not that Rock. The Rock.
Welcome to The Rock.
No, not that Rock. Yes, that Rock. Okay, good. So, Tarbell's dad was an oil man, and Rockefeller put him out of business. So this was a personal vendetta for her. She conducted remarkable investigative research, sold her story to a magazine. It was chopped up into 16 pieces, and it prompted an investigation of Standard Oil's practices in 1907, when, you guessed it, Teddy Roosevelt was president. As a result of this investigation in 1907, eventually, Standard Oil was sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil Company had to be broken up. It was broken up into 34 pieces, each of which then became remarkably valuable. In fact, it's a funny story. When Rockefeller was told about the Supreme Court's ruling, he was on the golf course. Can you imagine his assistant going, "Mr. Rockefeller, sir, I got bad news, You can just imagine this guy getting ready for the Darth Vader choke or something. The Supreme Court, sir, it's ordered that your company be broken up. Anything you want to say?" And Rockefeller's advice was, "You should buy stock in Standard Oil." Because once that company was broken up, each individual company became remarkably valuable. Now, no more Standard Oil monopoly, but, sometimes big and powerful stays big and powerful. Rockefeller was allowed to keep one of those companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later in the 20th century became known as Exxon, which in the 1990s merged to make ExxonMobil the largest oil company in the world. But anyway, muckraking work led to Teddy taking action. We've got Lincoln Steffens. Now, he's not on a national stage, but Lincoln Steffens writes a book called The Shame of the Cities. He writes about political machines. Now, of course, we already learned about political machines with New York City, right? This time we're not talking New York City. This time we're talking the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minnesota. And Lincoln Steffens' book leads to reform movements to try to clean up city governments. We've got Frank Norris. No, not Chuck Norris. Frank Norris. Frank Norris writes a book about the railroad monopolies in California called, wait for it, The Octopus. Because let's face it, the railroads were one kraken-sized octopus.
Release the Kraken!
And as a result, regulations were passed to, rein in the railroads. We already talked about Jacob Riis this year. Jacob Riis went around taking pictures to make How the Other Half Lives. This was before Teddy was president, but we can't get away from Teddy because this was in the 1890s when Teddy was commissioner of police in New York City, and he helped Lincoln Steffens clean up the slums and the dumbbell tenements. Now, muckraking also was used to expose one of America's worst pieces of dirt. When we talk about this progressive era during this unit, we'll find there were some great reforms. Again, your food, busting octopuses, Teddy and the environment, busting trusts. But where the progressive era really falls short is when it comes to race. This is still the Jim Crow South. This is the New South. This is the era of segregation, of poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and Plessy versus Ferguson. It's also, sadly, an era of lynching in the South. And there was one woman, Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist. I'm going to reach, we're going to call her a muckraker a little bit. She's not usually associated with the muckrakers, but she's so important. We've got to talk about her. Ida B. Wells investigated, wrote, and exposed lynchings and other forms of racism in the South. And if we're going to give the progressive era a grade, we're going to find that, this is their worst grade when it comes to race relations. But we'll talk more about that in coming days. To finish up, it's always good to get your unicorn point, your synthesis point, and make a connection across time periods. So, two really good pieces of connection that we can look at. One, in the 1960s, there was a marine biologist named Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring about the dangers of all the new chemical pesticides that we were spraying on our food in an effort to get rid of critters, rodents, and bugs. The main one she focused on was called DDT.
Whoop. Oh, man. He blasted us.
No, John, not that DDT. This DDT. DDT was originally created as a chemical weapon. So yeah, no kidding, it was good at killing bugs and rodents and stuff like that. But when DDT was created and then used to spray on crops, and guys, it's ridiculous. I saw old newsreels showing DDT being sprayed. Oh, look, it's perfectly safe. Well, Carson points out, any animals that you don't kill with the DDT become more resistant. They become stronger. They become a bigger problem. More importantly, you're spraying this deadly chemical on our food. And then the rain comes. And when the rain comes, you're washing that DDT into our groundwater, the groundwater that we drink. DDT would lead to the almost extinction of the California condor, the biggest bird in North America, because it messed with their eggshells, made them too thin, so if the bird sat on them, squish, you have an omelet in the nest. As a result of Rachel Carson's book, you can really say the modern environmental movement was formed. DDT was banned. In 1970, the Earth Day movement began. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was created. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act were passed. Another great modern-day muckraker in the 1960s was a guy named Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. He used to be an executive in the American auto industry. I believe it was for GM. And he wrote about how American cars emphasized style and looks and not safety. How automobile makers knew they should have seatbelts as a mandatory feature in cars. The Chevy Corvair, I believe, was the one he called the most dangerous and deadly device known to mankind, because if it got in car accidents, it would burst into flames. As a result of Nader's actions, federal highway laws were passed to make cars safer. He later on went on to write a book called Unsafe at Any Height about the American airline industry. And in the 80s, had a bunch of lawyers working for him. They called them Naders Raiders, and they would sue corporations for making unsafe products. Like, little Happy Meals, little tiny toys that are choking hazards, stuff like that. So, if you don't like your car crashing, thank muckrakers. If you like the fact that you can drink clean water, thank a muckraker. If you like a big old slab of ribs on a barbecue, thank a muckraker. If I say muckrakers, you say digging up the dirt. These muckrakers are one of the best things to remember in terms of reform, in terms of the reforms they caused, and making connections throughout this time period. So that's all for today, and put away your chromies, homies.